We collide, we break down, caving in to our doubts. Faces filled with sadness. When words are said, we'll regret. I can see the fire that we made just to save us. When we try to make up for never letting go. Said the things we promised not to say, then we break up just to start all over, even though we know this is the hard way better. We can't be heartache together. This is the hard way better. We can't be heartache together. This is the hard way better. We can't be heartache together. This is the hard way better. Let's go back, let's start again, to a place a long time ago when I kissed your lips. I can see the fire that we made just to save us. When we try to make up for never letting go. Said the things we promised not to say, then we break up just to start all over, even though we know this is the hard way better. We can't be heartache together. This is the hard way better. We can't be heartache together.
Well, as you know, we have been in a series called Rivers and Roads, and today we actually wrap that conversation up. And I just want you to think, before we dive into that, I want you to just think about, when is the last time you've been driving down the road and you've been enticed to pull off, to take an exit, to pull into a restaurant, to go get something that was appealing. I think about in July every year, I wait for Cookout to roll out the watermelon milkshake. And now that it's the fall, we've got pumpkin pie milkshakes. And listen, the best one's still yet to come, because in December, that's right, my eggnog milkshakes will be back. And you can best bet, if I'm driving and I see a Cookout sign or I see the little blue road sign with Cookout logo on it, I'm going, I'm pulling off. I am enticed, right? I'm chasing what is appealing. I know that's kind of a fun example, but we've all done it. We've all chased after things that were appealing. And isn't it true that there are way too many examples in our life that eventually those things that we were chasing, those people that we were chasing, they lost some of their appeal, right? Perhaps some of the things that once were appealing to us have now lost their appeal, and now it's actually become a prison. There's a habit we can't kick, an addiction that we can't shake. And listen, I just want us to all agree, right? Can we just agree not to do that anymore? And I wish it was that easy. I wish I could say, all right, let's agree to do that, or to not do that anymore, and then this video's over. But unfortunately, it is not that easy. And that's the exact thing we've been talking about throughout this series, this single premise, this single principle that is direction determines destination. Direction determines destination. And although, like we said in week 1, we would like to think it is our intention, it's not that at all. It's not intention, it is direction. In fact, it's the opposite. It's normally whatever grabs our attention tends to steer the ship. It's not intention at all. It is the direction, and this direction that Jesus invites us into in Matthew 7, where he talks about wide is the gate, wide is the path that leads to destruction, but narrow is the gate, right, that leads to life. This direction, this narrow path is this upward, this life of upward, inward, outward, loving God completely, loving ourselves correctly, and loving others compassionately. The disconnect tends to come between what we intend for ourselves, what we intend for our family, what we intend for our career, what we intend for our relationship with God, what we intend financially, relationally, fill in the blank. The disconnect comes from what we intend and then the path that we're often on. Why is it that we so often choose what is appealing over what's truly satisfying? And friends, that's how I want to tie up this series today. I want to talk about the difference between what is appealing and what is satisfying, and why we are so often choosing the former as opposed to the latter. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the path that we have to avoid, right? The path that is wide, that leads to destruction, the path that we have to avoid is often paved by what's appealing. Think about it. What's newer, what's faster, what's bigger. Honey, if we get this card, we actually get flight points, right? We want shiny, we want newer, we want faster. And listen, not all these things are bad. Not all these things are even wrong. These things are just never enough. We want shiny. But I would like to submit to you that shiny does two things. Shiny lowers our defenses, and it raises our defensiveness. The things that we choose to chase after, to pursue, that are appealing, although we know that if we chase this, it may lead to consequences, it may lead to destruction, it may lead to a bad habit, it may lead to an addiction. These things that we are choosing to appeal, they're not always bad, they're not always wrong, but they're never enough. So it leads us on this relentless pursuit of never having enough, of never being enough. It lowers our defenses. We start doing things and saying things that normally we would never do. We start defending things and hiding things that normally we would never be involved in. In fact, I don't really want to go here as much today, but I do want to point out something I believe to be so helpful. It could be so helpful for you. Is if you are in an ongoing conversation with someone who has your best interest in mind, and you find yourself getting defensive, you really need to pay attention to why. And listen, we have to stop using the fact that they may not have all the information, they might not have the best attitude, that they may have bad timing and when they approach you and how they approach you. We have to stop using that as an excuse to not see what they see. There is something in our path that we can't see, or we're choosing not to see, that they can see, but we're using other things as an excuse to ignore that. We've got to stop, because here's the deal. Again, we're on this journey, right? The principle of path, that our direction, not intention, determines our destination. And if that is true, if we are distracted by what's on the path, well, then we're not going to be able to pay attention to where this path is taking us, because our eyes are distracted. Our gaze is preoccupied, and so we're obsessed by what's appealing, so we can't even pay attention to where it's leading us. That's why billboards and scenery cause us to drift. That's why every time we go to a new place, Brooke automatically asks me, hey, do you want me to drive? Because I'm the world's worst. I want to see. I want to observe. I've never been here before. I want to see what this mountain looks like. And then I want to go another mile. And then I want to see what this mountain looks like. Every time we go to the Blue Ridge Parkway, like it's really bad. Like I almost kill us every time. And so she's like, you just want me to drive, right? Because my gaze, what was intended to be a glance, has captured my gaze. That's why texting while driving gets us in accidents. I think we just need to admit that our eyes are too easily ensnared by things that we had no business glancing at to begin with. And when you are distracted by what's in your path, you can't see where that path is leading you to. We're emotionally attached. There's an emotional appeal to the things that distract us. Again, I enjoy being outdoors and in nature. Like it connects with me. It speaks to me. It replenishes me. So when I'm driving through scenery, there's an emotional appeal to that. Is that bad? Is that wrong? No, it's not. But if I don't pay attention to where I'm going, I'm going to run off the road. How much worse is it for the things that actually do harm to us or do harm to our relationships? So that's why I just think it's important. Right? Again, I'm not even preaching on this today, but I just think it's important that if you have someone in your life that is consistently speaking to you and they have your best interest in mind, and you just find yourself getting defensive all the time or trying to conceal things or not opening up, feeling like you can share to them the truth, like that's a red flag. You need to pay attention to that, because they have an advantage that you don't have, because they are not emotionally involved with him, with her, with that, with it. They just care about you. They care about your destination. And again, there's this disconnect so often in our lives with what we intend on and then the path that we actually are taking. We continue to choose what is appealing over what's satisfying. They're not the same thing. And we've all lived long enough to know that this is true. That what's appealing is not always satisfying. Yet we continue to make choices like they are. Paul actually writes about this in Galatians chapter 5. And here's some encouragement for some of you that you're still trying to figure out all this, like following Jesus, understanding the Bible, trusting the Word of God, like all these things. That Paul was a huge skeptic. In fact, his mission in life prior to this was to hunt Christians and kill them and silence them. He has a radical encounter with Christ. His life has changed. So now he's writing to Christians, and he's just kind of laying out some warnings for us. And so if you're kind of skeptic, then just understand where this is coming from. This is not coming from a lifelong follower, Bible thumper. This is coming from a Christian killer, murderer, transformed into a God-fearing, people-loving, church-planting person. Like Paul is writing this, and he says in verse 13 of chapter 5 that you, my brothers and sisters, here's some good news, were called to be free. I want everyone to say out loud, free. Okay, you were called to be free. Exactly. Now, if your version of Christianity is not liberating, then friends, you have signed on for the wrong version. And he's going to spend the next several verses unpacking what that means. But if your version of following Jesus and loving Jesus and being loved by God is not liberating to you, then you've signed up for the wrong version. He says, you were called to be free, but here's the first warning. Don't use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Like I know Halloween's coming up and like zombies and Walking Dead and the new Walking Dead show and all those things. Okay, we're not talking about zombies. It's a very churchy word. Here's simply what it means when he says don't indulge the flesh. Don't indulge your appetite. Everything that you see, you touch, you hear, you taste. In other words, don't allow this dynamic of your appetite to get to such a point that it gets you in trouble. In other words, don't say yes to every impulse. Not every impulse is sinful. Not every impulse is bad. Not every impulse is wrong. Some of them definitely are. And what Paul is warning against is like, hey, you were called to be free, but don't use your freedom to say yes to every impulse. Listen to me. This is what that means. Every time the hot and ready light is on at Krispy Kreme doesn't mean you have to go through the drive-thru. I know it pulls you, it calls out to you, but just because it's there, just because it's available, doesn't mean you should indulge in it every single time. Why? Because if you do, you actually lose your freedom. He goes on to say, like, don't indulge the flesh, don't indulge your appetite, don't give in to every impulse. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. That's an odd thing to say. You're talking about freedom and indulgence, and you're saying rather than do that, I should serve one another with love. Well, why does Paul say this? He says because the entire law, the Jewish law, which is about 613 commands, by the way, 613 things that if you want to follow God, you've got to hit every single one of these. Okay? It's a lot. Most of us can't even get through the 10 commandments, let alone 613. Paul says, here's why this is important. Because all 613 commands are fulfilled by keeping this, what? Everyone say it out loud. One. I know even if you're watching by yourself, say it. One command. Even if you're in your car right now and it's weird, say one. All 613 commands in the Jewish law are fulfilled by keeping this one command. He's literally repeating Jesus. What is this command? To love your neighbor as yourself. Love God completely, yourself correctly, and others compassionately. Love others the way you would want them to love you as yourself. In other words, here's what Paul is re-emphasizing. It's a direct quote from Jesus that if we get this right, everything else hinges on this. In other words, he is implying that even if you don't get anything else right, if you get this right, if you take this path that is narrow, wide is the gate of racism, wide is the gate of bigotry, wide is the gate of preference, wide of the gate is privilege, narrow is the gate to love others as yourself. If you get this right, then that means you're on the right path. You're going to make the right choices. You're heading in the right direction because direction determines destination. The essence of Christianity relationally is this: to love others as yourself. Okay, so how do we do this, Paul? This sounds great. How do I do this? I got to vote in a few weeks. How do I vote with that filter in mind rather than putting my politics on ahead of that? How do I filter my faith, my belief in Christ and His Word? How do I filter my politics through that rather than the other way around? He says it right here. Listen. If you ask me, how do I decide who to vote for? I'm going to show you this right here. How do I learn how to love my wife better? How can I parent better? How can I treat my employees better? How can I treat the person that drive through? Like here, right here, verse 16. So I say, walk in the Spirit. I'll tell you what, between flesh and gratifying flesh and talking about the Spirit, like we're hitting 2 for 2 on a themed sermon with October. But I'm not talking about something spooky or weird. Simply what Paul is saying here is that when we walk in the Spirit, that we are in sync with this internal nudging of God and His Spirit inside of us. We listen to the nudging of God. We listen to the voice of God, the direction, the impressions of God. We listen to this internal nudging. And when we do this, the Bible says you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. In other words, Paul is re-emphasizing week 2 of this series, that when we walk this way, when we trust Jesus, when He says this is the way, and we follow this path, when we live upward, inward, outward, when we love God completely, ourselves correctly, and others compassionately, when we do this, when we walk in the Spirit, we listen to what God is nudging us to do and respond and say or not do, we will not gratify the flesh. We will not be obsessed with the pursuit of what's appealing for the sake of what's satisfying. No, we would choose what is satisfying. We will find not just what is appealing temporarily, but what is satisfying eternally. How do I know this? Well, let's just keep reading. Because this is the war, right? This is the battle within. Verse 17 says, for the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. I find it interesting that what we ought to do is in conflict with what we want to do. And I know I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the only one that wakes up and you know what you ought to do, but it's at war with what you want to do. Or you find yourself in a situation, an altercation, a moment of confrontation, and what you should do is not what you end up doing. Or how you should respond is not how you end up responding. Right? Like we find ourselves in this conflict all the time. We find ourselves in this moment of pressure, this moment of choice where what's appealing is immediate. It's in front of us. It's right there. It's got our gaze. It's got our attention. And so now what we intend to do is no longer line up with where we're headed. And we're choosing these temporary things. We're choosing these moments of pleasure, these moments of passion, this instant gratification rather than eternal satisfaction. Why do we embrace and chase what is appealing? It's because of this strong emotional appeal. And I just want to put this out there because I don't know that anyone ever really said this to me. You know, you grew up hearing follow your heart and all those things, right? Like, and if it feels good, do it. And if it feels right, do it. And if you want it, and if it's to be, it's up to you, right? To do like all these things. But I really believe that if there is a strong emotional appeal for something, that it should be a checkpoint, not a green flag. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't take it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't go there. Again, I don't know each and every little situation. I'm just saying if there's a strong emotional appeal, that should be a checkpoint, not a green flag, not a green light. That is a great time to start asking questions. That is a great time to start inviting other people in. Yet we often do the opposite. We get quiet, we get reserved, we pull away. Well, it feels right, I'm just going to do it. I want it, I'm just going to do it. Even though it's not what I ought to do, it's what I want to do. Even though I'm not sure how it's going to end, or even when I know how it's going to end. Even though what I said I intended to do, that this path is opposite. Like that, I'm just saying, like I know I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the only one. Verse 19, Paul kind of starts highlighting these list of distractions, the way that we gratify the flesh. In fact, he says the acts of flesh are obvious. Like selfishness is obvious. Like you don't need anyone to write a list for you to tell you how you're selfish. Like we know how we're selfish, right? And he just makes this list, and we're not going to read the whole thing. You can in verse 19. It's about 12 or 13 different things that Paul lists out. I just want to highlight 3. The first one is sexual immorality. And nothing, listen to me, nothing has the potential to undermine your future and others' future like sexual activity. And I'm not talking about enjoying the passion and the intimacy of a relationship that honors God. I'm talking about when a glance becomes a gaze, and then a gaze becomes a car wreck. Because you've given your attention to something that you should have never been glancing at to begin with. Sexual immorality will undermine our future. It will undermine others' future just because it's appealing. It's certainly not satisfying. The second is selfish ambition. In other words, I'm going to do this despite who it may hurt, who it may impact, who it may affect, because it betters me and it betters my situation. And oftentimes those are the things that we have to hide. I'm going to do this, but I hope she don't find out. I hope he don't find out. I hope God don't find out. I hope my boss don't find out. I hope I have to hide. I have to conceal it. The third thing is envy. In other words, I want what someone else has. And it's so often the case when it comes to envy, that person doesn't even know that you want what they have, or that you're trying to catch up to them. And then when you do catch up, when you do arrive, they don't even notice or care. And we've just wasted so much time and effort chasing after what they have, what's appealing. Paul says, in all these things, I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this, take it back 2 weeks ago, those who build their houses on sand, those who construct their lives on sand, well, they will not inherit the kingdom of God. That's strong language. To choose, to chase after what's appealing, to the neglect of how it affects you and other people. In other words, Paul said, like, there's not just consequences for that sin. There's loss. And I think those are things that we don't weigh when we make immediate emotional decisions to chase what's appealing, what has our attention, what's distracted us. That's why I said checkpoint. Doesn't mean you can't go after it if it's good and it's of God. Maybe it's just it's time to ask some questions. Why? Bring some people in. Get some perspective from people who have your best interest in mind. Because it's not just consequences, but it's also loss. But, verse 22, but for those who don't live this way, for those who walk in the Spirit, verse 22 says, the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit, in other words, the result, the outcome of saying yes to God, the outcome of listening to His nudging, the outcome of you choosing daily over and over to stay on this narrow path. The result of that, the fruit of that, is everything you've wanted anyways. The result of that, it's right here, is love. The result of that is joy. It is peace. It is kindness. It is faithfulness. It is gentleness. It's who you want to marry. It's who you should become. The result of saying yes to God, the fruit of that is love, joy, peace, kindness. It's what God is inviting you into. Like, that's the invitation. That's the direction. And the result, the reward of following that direction. A lot of us say we want that. My intention is love. My intention is kindness. My intention is finding faithfulness. But is the path you're on leading to that? Or are you distracted? Or are you giving your attention to other things? Here's the whole premise of what Paul is saying is like, I'm going to wrap all of it up in a nice little bow for you right here. But by the fruit of the Spirit, what I just went over, verse 22. Against such things, there is no law. What is Paul saying? He's saying, listen, sexual immorality, selfish ambitions, envy, drunkenness, jealousy, go down the list. There's restrictions. There's a law. Hey, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't engage with that. You shouldn't give in to that. You shouldn't take advantage of that. You shouldn't indulge in that. There are limits. There are restrictions to that. But love, there are no restrictions on love. Joy, there are no parameters on joy. Peace, please, no one's ever in their life said, God help me, my husband is too faithful. Like no one's ever said, God, please, I don't need any more love. Please stop lavishing your love upon me. Like no one's ever said, I'm too joyful today. Like unless you're walking down Main Street at the Magic Kingdom, maybe you felt a little bit close to that. But no one's ever said, I've got too much. Paul's saying, like, listen, the life that you want, but yet you're making all these choices that are in contradiction to that. The life that you want, that you really, really want, is right here. And there are no restrictions on it, that there is freedom. How did he start this passage? Hey, you were created to be free, but you're making choices based on what is appealing. And then those things are losing their appeal, and then they're becoming a prison. And now you've got all these habits, and now you've got all these addictions, and now you've got all this shame and regret. But there is a place to go with all those things. You can be rid of that. And you can stop focusing and choosing what is appealing and obtain what is satisfying, which is what you want anyway. Love, joy. You could live a life that doesn't create regret. You could live a life that you don't become someone else's regret. I feel like in a time when we can't predict anything, like when March showed up and COVID-19 started to be recognized here in the States and things started shutting down, none of us could predict 3 months into it what our lives would look like. None of us could have predicted that 8 months into it, this is what it looks like. None of us could predict what it's going to look like moving forward. But I can tell you that the best way to predict your future is to pay attention to the direction that you're headed in. What is that destination looking like for you right now? The premise of this, that direction determines destination. That's a principle, and that's a principle that can work for you or it can work against you. But you already know this, that choice is yours.